I began my academic interest in biology and somehow switched to philosophy in the third year of my undergraduate studies. I was fortunate in that for graduate school, I was accepted to one of the most prestigious graduate schools in the country in philosophy, the University of Pittsburgh. And there I went, and 4 years later, I had obtained my PhD. I then went to teach, and I went to Notre Dame. That was where I had my first job. I stayed there for 3 years, went to the University of Maryland, and was then hired with tenure as an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. That was truly one of the most awesome experiences of my career. And then I visited Oberlin College and decided to stay there. And so I was at Oberlin College for 4 years. I was at Oberlin College for 4 years. And then I received an offer from Syracuse University to become a full professor. So I came to Syracuse University in 1989 as a full professor of philosophy. So I've been here at Syracuse University for 20-some years, and I have truly enjoyed it. In the meantime, I've done a tremendous amount of writing. I've got about 110 articles and 3 books. So those books have been wonderful contributions in my life, and I'm constantly invited to write articles for various journals or newspapers, or to evaluate articles that have been submitted to be considered for publication. And in addition, I'm often invited to go to foreign countries, Greece, South America, Holland. Indeed, in Holland, I lectured before the Queen of Holland. Does not get much better than that in terms of having a sense of majesty. So my professional status has certainly been very, very good. And one might ask, why do I stay here at Syracuse? And the answer is, I enjoy teaching, and it's inexpensive. And one of the joys of my teaching is that I continue to attract a serious number of students. Each and every one of my classes is filled to capacity. I don't always teach a class of 400. Sometimes I teach a class of 200. I may teach a class of 40 or 50. But each class is filled to capacity. And the honest truth is, that's a very wonderful affirmation on the part of my students. Success in my own career has been tied to being perceptive, catching this, catching understanding, catching what guilt looks like. So I've written about guilt and helping people to understand that. Catching the difference between, grasping the difference between being comfortable with one's success as opposed to being arrogant with one's success. When we have been successful, we have every good reason to be pleased with ourselves about having made that achievement. Arrogance is something quite different. One spends all of one's time running around telling people how good one is. And I think that's inappropriate, that's arrogant. So part of what I do with my career and with my teaching of students is talk about the kinds of moral sensibilities that are characteristic of being a morally decent and upright human being. In my life, I've had several personal inspirations. One of them is a distinguished professor who's deceased, named John Rawls. I'd spent a year at Harvard, and John Rawls and I spent so very much time talking to one another, and that was a great fountain of inspiration. I've mentioned my advisor, Kurt Beyer, B-A-I-E-R, and he too was tremendously inspiring. Interestingly, some of my most significant instances of inspiration nowadays comes from my students. When a student catches an idea, sees the originality, sees the novelty of it, and understands the ways in which it can make a difference, that's very, very, very nice, because that tells me that I have the ability to speak to students and help them to understand a very important issue. And part of what makes teaching wonderful is precisely the fact that one can enable students to see the ways in which they can evolve for the better, and as well as see the ways in which they may want to change this or that form of behavior. With adults, I don't say much unless that person comes to me and says, I like your character, I like the way you seem to handle things, I wanted to talk to you about a question I have. It's important to come across to my students as being honest and sincere, but not bitter or angry or not condescending. And that's crucial, because the idea of having a rich conversation should never be to put somebody down, but to help someone to reach a higher level of goodness or moral or spiritual majesty. One of the joys of teaching is that insofar as the students stand as a moral mirror, it's very clear they don't see me as being the vicious professor. And I like that. That means a lot to me. They know I will engage them, I will raise good questions, I might even disagree with them, but I do so in a way that doesn't simply dismiss them, but say, that's a rich idea, but you want to think about this way rather than that way. And so there's a way of engaging in constructive criticism without being vicious. And I think one of the very gifts of teaching is the wherewithal to engage in constructive criticism without being at all vicious. Students have often helped me to see how I can grasp the reasonableness of trust. And trust is a good example, because quite often it's the nonverbal behavior of an individual that's the key factor in trusting an individual, and not what the person says, because one can always say anything, but how one says it can make all of the difference in the world. Although my parents died when I was very young, what made the enormous difference for me is that they had very high expectations of me. And my favorite example is when I wrote a paper and showed it to my mom. Her first move was, this is not good enough, you're much smarter than that. So I went back, went to my room and rewrote the paper. I did get an A on it, okay? Here's another example. I'm in high school, and there was a teacher whose name I still remember. I turned in the paper, I went to get it, he tore it up right in front of me. And he said, this is beneath your abilities. I cried, he said, go write another one. I did. Grade A+++. So those two examples were very important to me, because they both indicated, don't ever settle for less than your ability. And so on the moral front, it's always been important to me to do the right thing, no matter how awkward it may look in the eyes of others. On the intellectual front, my writing is always to be very thorough, very thoughtful, push the intellectual envelope as well as I can. And those two things have helped me to be very creative in the life that I live. One says in English, sui generis. That is to say, one is unique in one's own way of doing things. And in that regard, the desire to follow things in a very creative way has helped me to be successful and relatively unique, but at the same time without being, and this is important, without being arrogant. The philosopher David Hume said, the minds of human beings are like a mirror to one another's soul. And I think there's a deep, deep truth in that. And so part of what I do is understand the ways in which I might be a mirror to the life of other individuals. And of course, there are times when somebody's not committed to understanding. One of the gifts that we give to ourselves is perceptivity. And part of what it is to be perceptive is to see the small thing, not just a big thing, which anybody can see, right? I mean, nobody can miss an airplane taking off, it's too big, okay? But a small thing, that kind of insight about behavior has helped me to interact with others in a very productive and constructive manner. Oh, okay, sir, how would I like to be remembered? That is awesome. The dude who had not a lot of money. I would like to be remembered as the person who lived a decent life without being arrogant or condescending.